Poet nailed to the bone of the world comes in through his door to live until he dies. Whatever happens in between, in the night of the living dead, the poet remains alive, a fish with frog's eyes. Creation is perfect. The poet walks on the earth and observes the silent sphinx upon the Nile. The poet knows he must write the truth, even if he is killed for it, for the sphinx cannot be denied. Whenever a man denies it, a man dies. The poet lives in the midst of death and seeks the mystery of life, a stone reality in the realm of symbols, fantasy, and metaphor. For reasons that are his own, what is real is the pit of bones he comes from, a fish with God's eyes. Creation is perfect. The Buddha sits in silence and holds the poet and the world in separate hands, and he realizes he is born to die. The blood of the poet must flow in his poem, so much so that others demand an explanation. The poet answers that the poem is not to be explained. It is what it is. The reality of the poem cannot be denied. A fish with frog's eyes. Creation is perfect. The poet is alone with others like himself. The pain is born into the poet. He must live with it. It is his source of purity, suffering his legacy. The poet has to be stone, a fish with frog's eyes. Creation is perfect. When the poet protests the death he sees around him, the dead want him silenced. He dies like Lorca did, yet Lorca survives in his poem, woven into the deeps of life. The poet shocks those around him. He speaks openly of what authority has deemed unspeakable. He becomes the enemy of authority. While the poet lives, authority dies. His poem is forever. When the poet dies, a stone is placed on his grave. It is him, a pit of bones. Creation is perfect. In the pit of bones, a sky of stars, a heaven of suns and moons, and the great sun in the center. Creation is perfect. A mask created in the pit is the image of the poet. The image of the poet is a secret. A fish with frog's eyes. Creation is perfect. I have walked in this world with a cloak of death wrapped around me. I walked alone. Every kiss was a wound, every smile a threat. One day, death removed his cape from around me. I understand what I have lived for. I had no regrets. When the cloak was removed, I was in a pit of bones, a fish with frog's eyes. Creation is perfect. So, that's Robert Kaufman, and I wrote this paper, A Fish with Frog's Eyes, towards the poetics of encounter. Yes, I did include the obligatory poem at the end. Inspired by that poem, which has inspired me for a long time. Okay. I can't be as creative and bold this time. So I'm going to read this. Maybe talk as well. I timed myself, so I should be on time. Contemporary poet Kazim Ali asserts the existentially innate eloquence of poetry by lineating the rivers of its embodiments, through the pathways of the breath, through the circulatory and lymph systems, through the axons and dendrites of the nervous system. Poetry flows. Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Speaks and demands we respond. I know that its oscillations have had a sylvific power in my own life, and I know too that that's not very unusual. The liberatory force of power, the liberatory force of poetry, its spiritual and effective force is widely different. Because of this, my scholarly inquiries have gathered around questions regarding the soteriological nature of poetry, the manner in which it signifies beyond its participation in the human linguistic system. Gerald Bruns writes that poetry is language in excess of the functions of language. And because of this, it's able to evidence both visible and invisible reality. Poetry has the capacity to act transformatively on human consciousness, to shift the participant not just to another perspective, but to another order of being. While it's not necessary and probably not possible to explain this power, it has seemed necessary to me to investigate. After I encountered Buddhist Dharma and began to study and practice more sincerely, I began to widen this consideration and imagine poetry as a form of upaya, or a way of inculcating wisdom. In this regard, I am taken with the elegance of Heidegger's statement that poetry is not a special case of language. That on the contrary, the essence of language itself is poetry, from which, he writes, hardly a call resounds any longer. What I think Heidegger means by referring to poetry's desiccated core is that we have been so enchanted by language's utilitarian referential modes that we have misunderstood them to be primary. In the same way that we have frequently misunderstood the home ground of reason to be instrumental rather than dialectical or paradoxical. If poetry and its dialectic is in fact the home ground of language, then we can understand poetic expression as the self-expression of a complex system encompassing within its organization mind, matter, cognition, sensation, and sentiment. What is known among Buddhists as the five skandhas, what we can term quite appropriately is the intersecting loci of human world interactions. For Buddhists, these loci are not so much places where events occur, but the actuality of events themselves. The principle of interdependent being requires the interbeing of world and self, so that the nose, for instance, is an organ of the sense of smell, the aroma, the sensation of smelling, perception of aroma, objects emitting aromas, judgments, and so on, rely upon each other for their existence. In fact, no entity can be said to exist to come into being independent. Time, space, energy, form are all at once and continuously influencing and interpenetrating each other. The site of interdependent origination is nothing but independent origination. And this site, which is not one, is simply the place where individuals arise through being conditioned by other factors in the public life. Another way of speaking about interdependent being is through the recognition of the lack of independent self. Thus, we speak of the self as constituted by an emptiness, in which we recognize interdependent origination as synonymous with the non-relative vacancy that is the positive ground for occurring. That is, emptiness interdependence is the nature of occurring in the world, and such occurring is the nature of God. The point for poetry is this. If, in fact, the life that we encounter is construed of the tendencies of sheer ungraspability and utter interdependence, then language enacts this nature. You described it, the process of sending. It enacts this nature of uncertainty, codependence, and ever-flowingness perfectly. My claim here and elsewhere is that as language enacts ungraspability and endlessness, poetry renders these tendencies complete and transfers them to what Nishitani calls the realm of human sentiment. I am interested in sketching a kind of poetics of encounter, a very general way in which poets meet and are met by the contingencies of world and language. The Buddhistic understanding of ontology I've hastily sketched above has been given a philosophical structure by Nishida, who I've talked about. For Nishida, individuals exist as structures of dynamic expression. From the standpoint of the dialectical process Nishida calls contradictory self-identity, ourselves, as these dynamic structures, arise and develop through mutual codetermination. That is to say, we have no existence separate from the way we are conditioned by other things. Yes, mutual codetermination demands that at the same time, we in turn enact a conditioning influence on the things of our world. Ourselves then belong to the world as the world's own self-expressions. And moving from the created, as we arise, to the creating, as we influence, ourselves exert an influence on the world in the form of determining acts that are objectively realized. These expressions are formed through what Nishida terms poiesis, the activity within the structure of determination of self. So it is this interplay, the mutual determination of the created and the creating, that I would like to investigate a bit today, through the reading of two poems that clarify the activity of making poetry. While Bob Kaufman, here, and the other poet I discussed today, George Alpin, are both American poets working in the mid to late 20th century. There's much to distinguish them. Their class and ethnic backgrounds, as well as their temperaments, are quite different. Their work is associated with divergent poetic schools, and the men employ drastically different methods of composition and participation in poetic communities. We do have some points of comparison which are interesting, but I'll skip over that if you're interested in that. In a broader literary context, however, they are equally inheritors of the Western poetic tradition of one, the romantic horizon in which nature unfolds man's spiritual being, and two, the early 20th century American imagism, in which the isolated image makes visible the inner reality. One suggestion I want to make is that there is a foundational duality as well as an anthropocentricity in these notions that our poets reject. That the relations that the poems before us inscribe of humans and the things of their natural world is one of encounter rather than discovery. It is a subject of inquiry for me also whether the terms of this encounter may be found in the dialectic or self-contradictory identity of Nishida. As part of my investigation, I am sketching the agglomeration of tendencies that aggregate a possible direction or way toward making. First, there is something specific about attending to the call of poetry that is best elucidated by the verb notice. Noticing requires what Dogen Zenji calls attending to not thinking. That is, an open awareness and a willed active attentiveness to what occurs, including thought. Neither interior nor exterior reality is privileged as more real. Thus, images are not employed as presentations of an inner life, but they emerge as impressions of encounter. In this way also, oneself arises as experience through the activity of being conditioned by experience. As Alpin says in his poetries, one's subjectivity is encountered, not found. Making poetry has always been understood as a form of self-making. It is not self-making in the sense that we put the self forward through the use of symbolic imagery and metaphorical representations. Rather, it is self-making in the sense that we encounter the ground of the self's horizon. Words, a form of self-contradiction. Poiesis enacts both the negative and positive poles of interdependent being, as the self negates itself in the activity of being conditioned by the world and expresses itself as that activity. Kyoto school philosophers, particularly Nishida and Nishitani Kishi, who we'll speak of in a moment, are most often studied and celebrated for their focus on emptiness. In Buddhist terms, this emptiness is a negation of any substantiation and an insistence that the nature of our reality is an utterly ungraspable, incessant change. What do you make of this life that you cannot hold on to and will not go away? Nishitani conducted the most thorough, penetrating, and radical investigation of the nihility of any philosopher, I believe. Yet at the end of his life, he turned his attention to the poetic image as a positive expression of emptiness. Because of the intimacy of the poet and the image, the meanings developed through the emplacement of the image pass through metaphor to point to a more direct relationship. This direct relationship is realized by Zenists as a collapse of false duality known as seeing into true nature. But it's important to note that Nishitani's discussion of poetry, and the one I'd like to advance today, such a non-dual standpoint does not transcend the world of creative forming, language, symbol, and thought, but rather clarifies these dualities in light of Buddhist truth, or word I'm going to, kind of loaded word I'm going to use to talk a little about more Buddha nature. Here is what he writes. The word emptiness is particularly used in connection with the feeling of impermanence in the realm of world affairs. Moreover, within Buddhism, the usage is included in the doctrine as the principle of the impermanence of all things. From there, what we would call the negativity of the word has progressed in its thoroughness until it has turned into the meditative practice of contemplation of the void, and has reached the point of expressing a positive meaning as the fundamental self-consciousness of Buddhism. For Nishitani, poetry expresses, quote, an event at the root point where a fact is given and comes into existence. This root point is a bashma, a creative emptying that is simultaneously the unfolding of myriad forms. Thus, the arising of a given fact expresses the whole nature of reality. That's really cool. Yet this is not explicable knowledge. Nishitani writes about his poetic approach that it, quote, implies a course of inquiry that never departs from experience, but penetrates the source of experience. That statement is a succinct summation of this talk. The set of tendencies I am tracing derive from the primacy of experience and a commitment to examine not merely the contents of consciousness, that is, the objects of our experience, but the cognitive affective field in which those objects are lived, taken up, experienced, known. Oppen, the poet I'm going to turn to, George Oppen, speaks of constructing a method of thought from the images he encounters. Rather than using images to represent the poet's thought, he sits with them in order to test his own thought for sincerity. I am reminded of the well-known lines in Dogen's Gebser poem, in which he delineates different ways of occupying selfhood. Delusively, one imposes one's own understanding upon the face of the world. Or, one awakens to know oneself as witnessed by or constituted of the entire universe. In an often-cited interview with the critic L.S. Dembo, Oppen says, the important thing is that if we are talking about the nature of reality, then we are not really talking about our comment about it. We are talking about the apprehension of something, whether it is or not, whether one can make a thing of it or not. I'm often trying to describe how the test of images can be a test of whether one's thought is valid, whether or not one will consider the concept of humanity to be valid, something that is, or else have to regard it as being simply a word. A scrupulous ethic is described here to avoid imposing one's ideas about the world onto the things of the world. Oppen brackets out, as a phenomenologist might, the question of the absolute existence of things, and even the contradictions inherent in our nominations. In these remarks, Oppen refers to the sequence poem of Being Humorous. It's the poem that we're going to look at today. It's a section from Of Being Humorous. It was written, he says, to ask the question whether humanity could really exist, beyond its status as a category, whether it has a kind of lived quality, a lived meaning for us, or whether the word is simply unearthed. For Oppen, words can be empty in a relative sense, in that they can fail to arise from lived experience. He writes, referencing Mallarmé's well-known remark, Mallarmé famously said that a poem is made out of words. And Oppen says, no, a poem is not built out of words. One cannot make a poem by sticking words into it. It is the poem which makes the words and contains their meaning. This is interesting because one cannot reach out for roses and elephants and put them in a poem. The ground under the elephant, the air around him. One would have to know very precisely one's distance from the elephant, or step deliberately too close, close enough to frighten oneself. When the man writing is frightened by a word, he may have started. The poem as a whole being, cannot, of course, as Hopkins has told us, be explained. Explanations are discourses about the subject. The poem is an emergent expression. For often, the poet must not write what he knows. Far from being a record of an experience, the poem is the test of experience. The world as it is noticed, not as it is known. It may even be too intimate to be called experience. This intimacy with a known and unknown touch, as he says, is engendered by the poet's open attentiveness. It becomes a place of witness. A place wherein the poet is witnessed, authenticated by the world, and can therefore act with integrity. If the self-expressions of the poem are met, that is, if the images transfer themselves to the poet, if they are close enough, they gather drift and value and serve to clarify the poet's understanding. I want to highlight the poet's willingness to endure this kind of open encounter with experience. It involves a definition of truth as aletheia, never hear it said alone. As Heidegger has read the word to us, an unconcealing of what is always already unfolding. This unfolding occurs rationally as a paradoxical logic, existentially as self-contradiction. In this world in which everything is on fire, it asks the poet to be still amidst the burning. To iterate such employers of indeterminacy, to borrow Marjorie Carnwell's phrase, has been at issue for poets for some time. Leslie Scalapino speaks of poetry as observing and expressing the activity of the mind as it arises in concert with things. Attention as a form of experience. Michael Palmer postulates what he terms a counter-poetics, a poetry with a certain kind of complexity and resistance to meaning in the simplest sense, pre-inscribed meaning, conventional gestures, and so on. Michael Heller has suggested we consider poetry without credentials. Heller, a Buddhist practitioner, proposes a model of poetry grounded in an openness to experience, intelligence, and self-awareness that bears witness thoroughly and completely to an actual lived world, unconditioned by any a priori rigidity. Such witness continually undercuts the conventionalized constructs and arrangements of our normal thought patterns. The word uncertainty occurs in almost every adumbration of this poetic direction. And here I want to reiterate the importance of recognizing the twin semantic poles of conceptual terms such as uncertainty or indeterminacy. Because otherwise I think we are in danger of hardening them and turning them to dead tissue. Uncertainty serves a valuable function to destabilize conventional protocols, cliched sentiment, unlearned experience. It may be called the negative pole, the way in which it acts to empty ourselves of substantial identification attachment to concept. Uncertainty is not merely a form of negative capability, however. It is also an effective form of the infinite. It is ungraspability, the Buddhist Dharma of impermanence rendered as felt experience. In this sense, it not only clears away ignorance and cognitive afflictions, it also offers an experience of what Buddhists call the luminous nature of mind. Buddha nature. Nishitani originates his essay on poetic image by claiming that an image of empty sky functions to transfer the principle of absolute empty into the ordinary world of human feeling. The sky is the only form of infinity visible to the human eye. Its effectiveness at proclaiming emptiness, however, is not due to either our perceptual cognitive associations or to mimesis. The sky is in fact not merely like infinity, not merely a picture of infinity, it is infinite. And it is obvious to us by now that in accordance with the principle of imagination, every named thing is another name for infinite. Looking at reality from the side of our encounter, as it is met within and without, and seeing it clearly, is achieved through what Nishitani terms the imaging of emptiness. This image is not yanked from a dictionary, but encountered as a concrete thing that then transfers itself to its image. This image reflectively expresses its own origins, the origins of emptiness, and renders transparent the membrane between things. There's more explanation of this fascinating essay by Nishitani, which I'll skip so that I don't go over. Okay. The inner landscape, hidden within things, might be termed variously infiniteness, dharmadhatu, sunyata, buddhi nature, love. Nishitani's claims of the poetic image is that in rendering transparent our self-enclosures, it makes visible our radiant unity. Buddha nature, which is frequently or carelessly misunderstood or understood to refer to the potential. I'm sorry, I'm trying to skip over things. It's not. Let me get to something that makes sense. Okay, I'm skipping this. Talking about the way in which Nishitani speaks of the way in which the image is the same. The thing itself offers an image of itself. It presents an image of itself. And occupies an image of itself, which can then be known or understood through being taken up by the poet. And by poet, I would say not just the one that makes poetry by writing, but the one that makes poetry by reading as well. I'm so sorry. I wanted to be quick, and so I tried to skip things and still make it be coherent. Human nature is what I am referring to when we talk about the positive pole of emptiness. I'm talking about a way in which Buddhists understand the possibility or the freedom, time freedom and real freedom to exist always and be always already present in the world in all beings. Nishida uses the verb to whirl to characterize the simultaneous activities of emptying and filling. And I like that verb very much. To think about using that verb, you know that there is nothing in the world other than this world. And this to me brings up what Dogen Zenji means when he recharacterizes Buddha nature as not existing in sentient beings, but existing as entire being. Entire being, and what's later translated as the self and surrounding environment, is absolutely inclusive. There is not a speck of dust that lies outside entire being. Entire being is thoroughly commensurate with Buddha nature, and Buddha nature is thoroughly commensurate with entire being. As such, there is nothing left outside. There is nothing that is considered to be temperate as opposed to eternal. There is nothing that is considered to be temporary as opposed to permanent. As Dogen asserts in his Vascal on Buddha nature, the way to contemplate temporal conditions is through temporal conditions themselves. These conditions and their contemplation are not separate from true nature. Yet this contemplation does not exist separate from the subject who contemplates and the object that is contemplated. The interdependent nature of contemplation is directly seized. And I quote Dogen. Look! Temporal conditions. It is the Buddha nature's emancipated suchness. It is look! Buddha Buddha! It is look! Nature! Nature. It's in this way that I want to reference nature. Not as horizon into which the poet projects and discovers his imagination and effective depth, but as a contradictory and constantly shifting and affecting field of encounter with and among temporal conditions. This dialectic and dynamic tension constitutes the free activity and development of things in our world. And I'm skipping something else. Okay. Often begins the long sequence poem of being numerous with an absolute act of faith. There are things, he writes. That there are things is not only a matter of faith, but also an onus of responsibility. The first stanza reads, there are things we live among, and to see them is to know ourselves. One could reasonably say that the entirety of the following 40 sections composes a meditation on the manner in which the world and self are mutually conditioning. The permeability of our boundaries and the reality of our self-enclosures are equally weighted in the of human being as paradoxically collective and singular. It is necessary for one who wishes to retain his soul to honorably keep one's distance from the conventional habits promoted in the collective. At the same time, it is vital for the poet to avoid shipwreck, in which he loses contact with that which constitutes his design and is ground to sand. Here's the poem. Oops, been big. Here's the poem that I wanted to talk about now. It is section 27 from Of Being Numerous. And I want to argue that it articulates a compatriot dilemma to that of being both singular and collective. The poem's interrogation, how does a man or woman successfully negotiate and incorporate singular and collective existence? More urgently for Oppen, how does a poet speak, the one and the many? As such, it takes up the question of whether and to what degree poetic speech can be true. Speak, if you can, speak. How talk distantly of the people, walled avenues in which one cannot speak. It is not easy to speak. These and many other lines are peppered through Of Being Numerous. People talk, and that is a simple verb that is used most consistently and constantly through these poems. They talk, and their talk is by turns faltering, inadequate, explosive, and tragically unheard. Section 27 begins with the aposiopesis. It is difficult now to speak of poetry. The difficulty is inherent. One can speak about things, certainly. One can refer to their location, physical characteristics, their role in a given context. One can speak about one's own feelings for things, the transformation of things. One can even speak about the absence of things. To speak the true presence of a thing, one would have to speak of all being, as in Thich Nhat Hanh's example of the piece of paper, which contains the forest and the sunshine and the clouds and every man and woman who ever lived. How do you speak that? In the Fascicle Moon, Dogen articulates the way in which poetic language can be fully actualized to attain the brilliance and precision of Buddha nature expressing Buddha nature. He cites a poem he attributes to the historical Buddha. Dogen's poem goes like this. Buddha's true Dharma body as it is open sky. Things, forms appear, thus is the moon in water. Dogen asserts that the actual thing, the image of the thing, the poetic metaphor, and the way in which the experience of the thing hangs in the poet's awareness, all of these are utterly identical. He writes, in reference to that poem, the thusness of thus is the moon in water is the moon in water. Thus does not mean like something, thus means exactly. Thus is the basho, what Nishitani calls the place of the experience of reality. For Nishitani, poetry making investigates this place as an operation that brings reality to expression. The word elephant must be in its entirety that elephant, but how is such entire being accomplished by the poet? Oppen speaks of getting close enough to be frightened. One moves carefully, staying with it, resisting the impulse to argue or to judge. That's a quote. Oppen's hesitancy to make direct statement is evident in the first three stanzas. It is not precisely this, he writes. One would have to tell what happens. I would want to talk of rooms. The syntax indicates a direction of fathomableness, wandering through possible arteries of discourse, and an unwillingness to impose what has been previously thought upon that which is newly encountered. In a letter written 1 year before Of Being Numerous was published, and so when it was being written, Oppen writes, There are things, appearances around which the understanding gathers. The mission is to hold them, to try again and again to find the word, the syntax, the cadence of unfolding, a matter of being able to say what one is and where one is and what matters. In this same letter, he repeats his intention not to set down in poetry what he already knows. The poem is a test of what is true, what is actual in one human life, and the poem itself is that test rather than the results of it. Here, the understanding gathers around the figure of a workman, a man born, as we all are, into a world which shapes, conditions, and circumscribes his being insistently and incessantly. In order to speak cogently of a man, one must involve the context in which he appears, the forces that determine the unfolding of his being through time and space. I won't pronounce this right either, the Ding und Sick does not exist aside from this, and yet the occasion of his being cannot be reduced to it. The image is of a room, a basement, an image of second nature arising roughly and stubbornly from first nature. From the creating to the created, the rooms bear the marks of their origins, constitute the presence of the men who formed them. The actual forms made of wood have been removed after the concrete has hardened and been consigned to the dump. Long since rotted and decomposed, the marks of the forms sustain themselves in the impress of the wall. Long since dead, the men who carried the brick and mortar and sawn lumber to the site of this building are likewise present within these rooms. There is a Tibetan word, shul, that refers to emptiness in terms of an impress, the mark that lingers after that which has made it has passed on. Thusly, the way in which things imprint each other is made visible as a kind of trace. As Derrida uses the term, the absent presence of being. Why does a child's toy take on an aura of sadness when the child is long absent? As our constructions bear witness to our conditioned history, so do our lives. The poet, too, bears an impress of that which has settled, marked, and moved on. The syntax of Oppin's lines indicate that which leaves its impress. The trace borne by the floor sweeper is poetry, that peculiar word. And of course, the entire history of all poetry does appear in every poem, like the jewels in Indra's net, each poem reflecting and containing all others. And of course, this is, as many critics have remarked upon in various ways, the onus and gift of the singular poet. Oppin, however, while concerned with the poet as versifier, and as versifier concerned with influence, opens the work of poetry here to mean more than versifying, but what gathers around the image of a workman, trust in one's materials, attentiveness, the consideration of space, temporal conditions, discipline, labor. The way poetry emerges as a test of sincerity is as a way of sincerity. The shul is a track, a path, such as those of grass tamped by the feet of deer as they find their way to water. As one sweeps the floor, one makes tracks of dust, tracks in which concrete or tile or wood burst through from an enclosure of dust. What is profoundly hidden is precisely these temporal conditions, these marks of the forms, this crushed dandelion dust beside ordinary grass. It is profoundly hidden because it is hiding in plain sight. It is, look, splinters in the window. What is hidden in infiniteness. Our hiddenness floats in infiniteness, as infiniteness. To sweep the dust continues indefinitely. Poetry, however, Oppin writes here, is not precisely a question of profundity, but a different order of experience. The task of poetry, in other words, is not to deepen our affective experience or cognitive understanding. Remember, poetry is not a special case of language. It implies and enacts a different structure in the organization of being, a different order of experience. That this experience cannot be explained, we know. The poet's radical aloneness, in both Oppin's verse and Kaufman's, is directly related to the inexplicability of the poem. Entire being is also at the same time unique being, solitary being. Our self-enclosures are real and really felt. Because of this distance from each other, according to Nishitani, the only possible form of knowing is through experience from within. And this is, I think, the love knowing that his teacher talked about. Knowing from solitude occurs through the activity of transparency. It describes the power of the poetic image to render transparent the boundary wall of individuality, so that being enters into a revolving reciprocal relationship with other beings. And he has a fantastic analogy to explain that, which if I had a pen, I could draw. There's two rooms. Mr. Tiny talks about two rooms. Room A, room B. They're part of the same house, share a wall. The wall that makes up room A serves as the boundary of room B. As such, room A is constituted by being room B and vice versa. What Nishitani means when he talks about the image, the image is able to render that boundary line transparent, so that the reciprocity, the reciprocal existential condition of things is made clear. Obviously, tearing down the wall would destroy the integrity of the rooms. In this way, the rooms retain their distinctiveness, and yet their interdependent being is made transparent. The task of poetry and the task of the solitary poet, whose integrity lies in the recognition and acceptance of that solitude, is to render transparent our self-enclosures. To do so, he must stand in a different order of experience, what Oppen refers to in the last stanza as the level of art. While this vision is clearly a holistic one, it does not dissolve distinctiveness. For Nishitani, knowing is equal with making things transparent. Oppen, who has voiced clarity as his motive for poetry, and writes earlier in this poem, clarity in the sense of transparency. I want to notice the way in which the discursive hesitancy has disappeared in the last stanza. The phrase, such solitude as we know, which appeared as aposiopesis in the third stanza, is repeated and completed in the fourth with a full stop. The knowledge of himself as singular is the basis for the poet's realization of the interpenetration of the historical, physical, psychic, cultural causes and conditions that constitute our lives. For the poet to work in the humble sense of the word, in order that poetic labor occur, it is imperative that the boundaries between things are rendered transparent. When Dogen says the self and surrounding environment of sentient beings, George Oppen says, see the one thing. The poet holds the place open in which the self-expression of self-expressing reality may occur. I know I don't have much time, and I didn't have much time to do a full reading of the poet, but I want to say just one or two things about the poet. It was written in 1980. Kafka died in 86, and it is not a young person's declaration of what writing poetry means. It is a man who has dedicated his entire life to poetry, describing what the young poet means. It's a declamation of the poet's position in the social order and of the poet's obligation to truth. It organizes a series of tensions that are usually considered to appear in those contexts. Many of these tensions are simple oppositions: life, death, time, eternity, truth, lies, authority, anarchy, freedom, reality, fantasy, etc. The proper position for the poet, asserts Kaufman, is not on either side of these dualities, but in the space in which they no longer debate. The poem is a response to, can be seen as deriving from, a very short verse by Langston Hughes called Wise Men, which goes like this. Let me become dead-eyed like a fish. I'm sure then I'd be wise. For all the wise men I've seen have had dead eyes. Let me learn to fit all things into law and rule. I'd be the proper person then to teach us. This poem's energy clearly derives from the duplex meaning of wisdom. On the one hand, Hughes recognizes the possibility of true wisdom in the very irony with which he acknowledges the way that the social and political orders substitute instrumental reason and acculturated habit for true understanding. Those who are rewarded for judging the shadows on the wall best have dead eyes like a fish. Bob Kaufman's entire poetic career and his position as founder of the literary beat movement testify to his concurrence with Hughes, that conventionally accepted wisdom and cultural forms do not possess living energy, and thus cannot act or speak truly. His poem, The Poet, however, is not so much incriminatory as it is exclamatory. And here's where I wanted to make the just brief argument that the poet expresses the positive pole. Commentators on Kaufman's poetry frequently speak of his surrealist imagery in a way that assumes such images are produced to disorient linear causality and frustrate discursive thought. Whether or not that's actually an appropriate characterization of surrealism, it's not an appropriate characterization of Kaufman's project here. I mentioned, I talked earlier when I didn't read this, but I spoke of the brief poem, The Stone Woman Giving Birth, which is a paradoxical statement. A fish with frog's eyes, stone woman giving birth. Poem practice, like meditation practice, does function to create distance from habit thought and loosen our attachment to substantive identification. So it has the negative pull. It opens and promotes an awareness of emptiness and non-being, contemplation. The colon, however, has another pull, and I would say more primally, enacts the positive mode of emptiness as a form of direct singing, an exclamation of being as it is, in dialectical relationship, as paradoxical self-contradictory it can be, as Prajna Paramita, as a fish with frog's eyes. It is not to be explained, it is what it is, the reality of the poem cannot be. So this is very end. Nishitani opens Emptiness and Sameness by stating that the image of the sky holds a special place in Buddhist literature because the sky is the only eternal thing we can see with our eyes, and thus it is infiniteness for us. Beyond metaphor, endlessness as empty sky is a given fact, a reality. In Moon, Dogen writes, Buddhist true Dharma body is the as it is of open sky. The entire earth, the entire universe, all phenomena, and all appearances are open sky. Kaufman's poet is alone with others like himself. Ensconced in the solitude of embodied awareness, he is at one and the same time enmeshed with interdependent being. The pit of bones from which he arises, from which being arises, is at the same time what being is. It is him, a pit of bones. Creation is perfect. There's so much to say about Kaufman's poem. He's obviously enacting a shamanic life. I mean, it's very clear from references to Lorca, from Price, from the references of the notion of life and death being interchangeable existential realities, the way in which he participates in a descent to the underworld. There's so much to be said about the way he radically equates opposites. He holds a very pivotal place as an image. Here, I wanted to say one thing about it, which is that the pit of bones is the site of independent origin, it is the site of infinite, it is the site of creativity. It is also equated with the poet. And then I want to just give you two quotations. First, Dogen. The time when the moon appears is not necessarily night. Night is not necessarily dark. Do not be limited to the narrow view held by human beings. Even when there is no sun or moon, there is day and night. Sun and moon are not day and night. Each is as it is. In the pit of bones, a sky of stars, a heaven of suns and moons, and the great sun in the same. A fish with frog's eyes. creation. I'm so sorry that I stumbled and fell. Thank you for being so kind.
Well, that was about 45 minutes, but I hate not to have questions or comments. So maybe,
Yeah,
no, don't be sorry, it was great. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just 1 or 2 comments. So if we give up our break, we're back on time. 2 or 3 minutes, I'll put us 2 or 3 minutes behind. You might want to break, talk about that in a minute.
I loved your poetry, and I love it. Just so pleasant, and I love that all the visual arts. So just thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. It's on the left. Find it. Good, let's all have a break instead, that'd be much better.
Okay, let's start at